Hello, and welcome to the Families Embracing Diversity podcast. I'm your host, Vanessa, and today we have the pleasure of speaking with Rebekah Ginepapp about anti-racism resources for parents and educators of white kids. Rebekah Ginepapp, if you're not familiar with her, is the author of Raising Anti-Racist Kids, an age-by-age guide for parents of white children. She's a speaker and parenting coach whose work focuses on nurturing a commitment to social justice and anti-racism in children, especially in those families who hold privilege. Her work has been featured by the Washington Post, Brown City, Parenting Forward, and MLK 50, Justice Through Journalism. Rebekah is also ordained in the United Methodist Church and lives with her family in Memphis, Tennessee. You definitely don't want to miss this conversation, so let's jump in and get started. Thank you so much, Rebekah, for being here. The first thing I wanted to ask you about, you focus specifically on how parents and educators can have conversations about race and racism with white kids. Why is it necessary to have anti-racist tools specifically for white children, white people?
So I think that the work of anti-racism has somewhat different paths for people of color and white people. I think those paths are complementary, and there's lots of places for us to do our work together. But I really appreciated something that Francie Latour, who's a children's book author, and she leads a group called We the People. She talks about, as a Black woman, she feels like her primary anti-racism task is to heal from the effects of racism and help other Black people do that. And that white people's primary task should be to dismantle racism. And I think, one of the things about whiteness is that those of us who are white are taught not to see it. And so it takes a lot of intentional work to start seeing the things about white culture, about how white privilege and white supremacy are at work in subtle ways, daily ways in our lives. So I think that takes some additional work for white people to do so that we can be more effective participants in anti-racist movements instead of kind of bringing all that lack of awareness in and weighing down things like activist efforts with our ignorance that society has encouraged us to have.
That's very true. That is very true. And I think a lot of times we think that we're helping when really we are not. The ignorance is making it more difficult. What led you to this work? What led you to start doing this?
So I guess it depends on if you want. I'll give you the short version. There's like on my website, I even have sort of the long version. But the short version is that before I had my younger son, so I'm a stepmom to a 23-year-old and mom to a 10-year-old. And I used to direct a worker rights organization. It was a faith-based group. I'm a United Methodist minister, and I did that for about 10 years. And I told a lot of people it was my baby, and I kind of had an unhealthy perfectionist relationship to work. And then when I had my younger son, I kept doing that for a few months. And then I was just like, this is not working for me. I feel like I'm not doing a good job at either of these things, being a mom and being a community organizer. So I started staying at home with him. And I got a little antsy. And so I started blogging about children's books because I've always loved children's books. I originally thought I was going to be an elementary teacher when I started college. My mom's an elementary teacher. So I had like my stack of children's books starring Black characters because I live in Memphis and I thought I would be teaching there. And so I started blogging about children's books again. And then around the time that my son was 4, he had started to make some remarks, like expressing fear sometimes of Black men. I'm trying to remember what else, but just some cues. And this was also 2016. So we saw Donald Trump get elected with very openly hateful rhetoric. I felt this urgent sense of, how do I get back into social justice work? I know that being a community organizer is not right for me right now. And like, how do I talk to my kid about this? Because I do want him to be aware of these issues. I want to address these fears that he's having. And I realized there was kind of a white bubble that I had surrounded him in our majority Black city that was really different than the way I had grown up here, because I went to public school. So I just started writing a little bit about it. It was writing about our experimenting, books we were reading. I started learning from other people like Jennifer Harvey, who's written about doing anti-racism work with white children, and just trying a little bit at a time and trying my hand at kind of involving him in some of the at-home activism I was doing, like writing letters to members of Congress and things like that. And then eventually I realized I had enough of those kinds of blog posts and small resources that I wanted to create something more organized for parents of white children, because a lot of times our difficulty is knowing what to do at different ages, what's appropriate. And so that's how I ended up writing my book, Raising Anti-Racist Kids.
We share a lot of very similar things. That's very interesting. I've heard pushback that white people shouldn't be anti-racism educators. And you mentioned this a little bit in the reasoning why you focus specifically on white children and white people in your work. But how do you handle that tension? How do you deal with that?
Yeah, so I do think it's really important that anyone who is white and trying to do anti-racism work have mentors who are, longtime leaders in anti-racism work that are people of color. And there's a lot of place for multiracial settings. So for example, I'm in a group right now with my denomination, a local group where we're doing an anti-racism study together. And it's about half and half white participants and Black participants. But there's also, like I said, a lot of work we need to do on our own. And I think sometimes when we say, oh, white people shouldn't lead anti-racism work, it can be kind of a way of avoiding responsibility, of kind of almost acting like we ourselves are children who are adults and we don't know what to do. And I think there's a difference between following the lead of anti-racist leaders of color and expecting them to do work for us that we as white people need to figure out how to do on our own. I've had some different social justice and children's spaces that I've been in that have been that are led by women of color, like Cindy Wong Brandt, who leads a community called Parenting Forward. And she would often, she is Asian American, and she's not Asian American, she's Taiwanese. She lives in Taiwan. She used to live in the US. And she just said, I get tired of answering white people's really basic questions about racism, and then a lot of times the pushback I get for that. So she appreciated kind of being able to hand people off to me, And I do think that is one way to, for white people to do the work, is relieve some of the burden off of people of color so they can focus on however they want to be doing anti-racism work, which might be, working in their own communities, or it might be something different.
That's a very good point. That's very true. And there's so many resources out there that people just don't make an effort to look for sometimes. So we shouldn't be bombarding people of color with these basic questions that you could read a book and get answers to. What would you say then it takes to be a good white ally? You mentioned that sometimes our ignorance gets in the way when we're trying to help with activism work.
Yeah, I mean, I think the first thing I would say is I kind of prefer, there's people that will debate about, should we say ally, should we say co-conspirator, da, da, da. I won't get into that, but I do prefer to think of it as doing ally work or doing co-conspirator work, because like labeling ourselves as, oh, I'm an ally, can lead to some complacency, some feeling of like, oh, I've got it, and these other white people, they don't get it. So that's the first thing I would say about that. But I would say when we're in multiracial settings, really taking the space to listen, to be curious within ourselves when we feel kind of reactions, instead of always verbalizing that, because thinking about the courage it takes people of color to speak up about racism, knowing how often white people will try to shut them down or argue with them. So listening, and if you feel some resistance, see if you can find another white person who has a bent towards anti-racism that you can talk about with that, right? Work through that. And then, of course, amplifying the calls of justice of people of color. I really recommend. There's so many social justice issues related to racism, and I think especially when you're a parent, you're busy. So finding one that particularly calls to you. For some people, that might be segregation in your local school system. For other people, it might be immigration, changing the criminal justice system, this kind of thing. So pick one thing, because you can't do everything and you'll burn out kind of quickly. But look for the ways that you can take part, because there are things we can do, out in the community. There's also things we can do at home, but you can find something that will fit with your personality. There's not like one way to do activism. And then I think the other thing is, we kind of talked a little bit at this already, but try to see how whiteness is operating in your life, in your world. So looking for, one of the things that I learned from a really great anti-racism educator named Amanda Kemp. She has a group called Racial Justice from the Heart. And I took an anti-bias class from her, and she said, I want you to go around your home and look for any visual or audio cues you have about people of color that are negative, that can encourage stereotyping. And this could be really subtle. And identify those things. And then I want you to think about how you're going to replace some of them with positive representations. And doing that kind of work is like over and over and over again. So just that process of noticing, and the more you do it, the better you will get at it, and the more able you'll be able to talk to other white people about it, to help them also see whiteness, so that we can deconstruct it.
This is kind of putting me on the spot, but do you remember any of the examples that you found? I love the idea of that activity, but I feel like for someone just beginning, they might not know even what to look for.
Yeah. So when I thought about negative representations, I actually realized it was more for me of an absence. And so one of the things I noticed is a lot of the artwork and stories and other things that we had were about racial injustice that Black people faced. And I think this is, in my son, when he was younger, even I could tell we were kind of getting into this, like, almost never said, I feel sorry for people who are Black, but, you could tell he was getting the idea that being Black was mostly about experiencing oppression, instead of being a full, whole person. And so I asked my mother to get me a copy of this painting by an artist named Bart Cooper, and it's called Black Boy Zen. And it's a young Black boy who's just meditating. I think there's a flower next to him. He looks so peaceful. And I hang that right. It's in my office / our homeschool area. So I see it all the time. My son sees it all the time, to remind me of joy and peace within Black communities too, so that we're really thinking about people as whole people. So that was one of the things I decided to do.
That's a great idea.
Yeah, and sometimes too, what I noticed when I first started auditing our book collection, when Daniel was probably 4 or 5, is that I think I realized I had no books with any Asian characters. Almost all the Black books that we had were about slavery or civil rights. There weren't any where Black kids were just having fun and going to grandma's house. And so that was one of the first changes I started to make, is look for those everyday books.
And that's such a simple change that anybody could do. It's just taking the intentionality to realize that you have that void in your home. So what do conversations with your son about race and racism look like now that he's a little older?
Yeah, so actually just this morning, since we homeschool, I found this story that I wanted to read him. He loves the book series, The Unicorn Rescue Society, kind of combines like fantasy with historical fiction. And I saw that the author of that, Adam Gidwitz, had written an essay in a book of essays by a lot of different children's authors called The Talk. And it's looking at how each of these authors has talked to their own children about race. And so he had one called not our legacy, our inheritance. And it was talking to his daughter about, she wanted to know, do we know any racist people? I don't think we would know any racist people. And he was trying to get her to understand that, as white people who had benefited, and he had some pretty specific ways in their family history from racism, that they couldn't point their fingers outwards for the racist and had to realize it was them as well. And so when I got done reading it, I asked my son, well, do you think that has anything to do with us? And he said, yeah. And I said, okay, so what do you think it has to do with us? And he said, I'm sleepy, which is it's kind of standard answer when we're homeschooling and I ask him complicated questions. But then he said, well, I don't know that much about our ancestors, but I wonder, if we had something similar. And so then I told him, I said, I don't know about, Daddy's ancestry because his family's people, immigrated more recently, but I know that on my side of the family, there's at least this one ancestor who it's very clear that he enslaved people. And we talked a little bit about that. And, I think it's important to have those conversations young, because the point isn't to make him feel guilty about that. We talked about like how it makes you feel more responsibility that I should do something. Because not just as a generic white person do I benefit from this, but like we know in our family that we have. And I just find we've done this for so long now that it's just pretty low key and ordinary for us to talk about this kind of stuff, which makes me hopeful that as he gets older, maybe he'll be able to talk to other white kids about this who haven't been having as many discussions. And kind of, help in the anti-racism movement in that way.
That is a very deep, reflective conversation for earlier in the morning. I think I'd say I was.
No, of course, he also said that when I was trying to do geometry with him. So,
Yep, I think I'm on his side for that one. When obviously you've been having these conversations with him for most of his life. When he was younger, you mentioned you read a lot of books, but how did you form those conversations then?
Yeah, and I should say, like, the first couple times he said something biased that he was like repeating someone else, I definitely had this reaction of like, oh no, and kind of freaking out. And so our very first conversations about race, I wouldn't recommend imitating in any way, but because I think there's a much more gentle, calm way to have those conversations that I know how to do now. But one of the first things I remember us doing is, so he attended a private Montessori school for 4 years, and almost all the children were white. And there was a classmate of his that was South Asian, and he would call him, he never knew anyone's names. Like, he knew like 2 kids' names. That's still kind of how he is today. But he would refer to this other child as the kid with the black skin. And for one thing, I was like, well, he needs to learn his name, but also I knew this child was not African American. So we started talking more about skin tone, and I would sometimes, my son has a little bit darker skin tone than I do, although we're both white. And so I'd lay our arms next to each other, and I would like say, oh, your skin is kind of a light tan, and mine's more peachy, and we both have skin we call white. Because I could tell already he was kind of getting this idea that like, kids with dark skin have color and I don't have color. I'm just what everyone is because of this environment that he was in. So that was one of the early conversations that we had. And just like unpacking things when he would say them. And what I realized, especially when he was younger, is it took having the same conversation a lot of times before I would start to see that he was learning from it. We would talk about like who was missing from books, like if it was, or shows that like all the characters were white. And it was really interesting in this peace camp that I helped lead that he went to. And And I had never said anything specifically to him about Charlie Brown, but he had watched Charlie Brown. And so when we were trying to talk with the kids about what is racism, he piped up and said, well, the only Black person on Charlie Brown is Franklin. And that's racist. There should be not just white people on there, not just one Black person. And I thought, okay, well, so this is working, because he's noticing some of this stuff on his own, because we practiced doing it.
That is such a good point. I think as adults, it can get so frustrating to think, we talked about this already, though. You should know. And that's not how kids learn. It takes a lot of repetition.
Yes.
a lot.
And as adults, we take more repetition, I think, than we think we do. But developmentally, children definitely need the repetition.
We forgive ourselves for our mistakes, and we expect them to hold it together.
Yeah.
Oh, very true. Very true. So let's say there is a white woman or a woman of white children listening, and she is just starting her anti-racist journey. Where should she start?
Yeah, so I think it's important for us to do our own work as adults, but not feel like, oh, I need to do years and years before I can start doing this work with my children. And a model that I came across recently in this anti-racism group with my denomination that I'm in, it's by an author named Jamar Tisby, and his work is explicitly Christian, so it's not for everyone, but his model could definitely be adapted to secular settings or other religions. But he talks about the ARC model, and the A is for awareness, the R is for relationships, and the C is for commitment, which I would say could also be like action. And I think you really do have to start with awareness, which is educating yourself about how race impacts people, the history of racism. And so, a book that you might look for a book that's a good overview, or you might want to dive specifically into like your community, if there are museums there or other resources that you can learn from. And then with relationships, he's primarily talking about forming authentic relationships if you are white with people of color. But he emphasizes like, this is not, going in. When I was in seminary, one of my Black classmates told me that a white student had said, will you be my Black friend? That's not what we're talking about. But people who you would be likely to form friendships with because of common interest anyway. And so that might mean taking yourself to settings where you're more likely to be able to get to know and form friendships with a person of color. So I know that Lucretia Berry from Brownicity told me about one of her friends who's white, who decided she wanted to take a Zumba class. And so she signed up for one, not in her own white neighborhood, but in a community center where she knew mostly Black people would probably be taking that class with her. And I would say it's also important for white people to try to form relationships with other white people who are committed to anti-racism for the reasons we've talked about before. And then once you've done some of that work, both on awareness and you can start with the commitment next and then work on relationships. But commitment's all about finding your place to take action. Where are you committing to not just doing things for a little while and then deciding you're too busy, but to really stay in it for the long haul. And so once you've started getting going a little bit, you don't need to be that far ahead of your child to be able to do this work with them. And I have a lot of resources. If you go on my blog's homepage and scroll down, there's a post that's specifically a guide for parents of white children about how to talk about race and things you can do at different ages. So that's a good place to start if you're looking for something that's got some choices for you.
That is a very helpful guide. I've looked at that guide. I'm going to put the link of it in the description so that people can find it easily. So can you give us the name of your blog, where they would find you, or anywhere else they could connect with you to learn more about what you're doing?
Yeah, so it's my name, which is Rebekah Gienapp. So definitely look at the show notes for how to spell that. But it used to be called The Barefoot Mommy. So you can also just Google that, and it's The Barefoot Mommy. My site, Rebekah Gienapp, should be right at the top. I am pretty hit or miss on social media. So I usually recommend that people sign up for my email list. You'll see like on the website, it says start here, and there's some different free guides that'll get you on the email list because I'm really consistent in sharing stuff there. But like, I think I just shared something on Facebook this week for the first time in like 3 months. So that would be the best way to stay in touch.
I don't blame you. Social media is good.
Yeah, it's overwhelming. I don't find it the most helpful tool in life, or but for some people it is.
Yeah, not me either, but for some people, yes, it's very helpful. Well, thank you very much for taking the time to share all of this information.
Thanks so much for having me.
Is there anything else you want to add before we?
The only other thing I think we haven't talked about that I feel like is really important, especially for white people that are early in this, is to be patient with yourself and other white people. Because one of the things that can happen as we start to get into anti-racism is we see all the ways we've been silent or messed up in the past, and so we get really rigid and harsh. And that's a stage that's common, but if you stay there, you're going to probably burn out or bump back to like, I think like sort of being, I don't want to talk about race doesn't matter. So and that doesn't mean like being complacent and saying, oh, I don't need to do anything, but to be, forgiving of yourself and the other white people in your life.
What are some ways people can get out of that stage when they recognize they're there?
Yeah. So if it's about yourself, I would say pause and think about, okay, what did I learn from this? And so even though what I did, maybe you caused someone else harm, I learned from this. And so in the future, I'm going to be able to do things differently. I think having another white person who's committed to anti-racism to talk to you can be good, because otherwise you're either going to like stuff it down, or you're going to dump it on a person of color who doesn't necessarily want to hear about you feeling guilty about the thing you did. And then I think being aware of how racism lives in our bodies is really important. There's a wonderful book called My Grandmother's Hands by Resmaa Menakem, and it has a section on Black bodies, white bodies, and police bodies, and how racism affects our bodies. And he's got really good breathing techniques and other things you can do to like physically calm your body enough to change your thinking and your actions.
I'm gonna have to write that one down. That's something. Perfect. Yeah, I think we value a lot as white people perfection, and part of learning is making mistakes. And so there's my son was doing this mindfulness program, and it taught him this phrase that said, I made a mistake, but I'm still a good kid. I think sometimes as adults, we need to do that too. I made a mistake, but I'm still a good person. I'm learning.
Yes. Yeah. And we are not our actions. We are not the best things we've ever done, and we're not the worst things we've ever done.
Right. It's a journey. It's definitely a journey. Well, thank you very much for all of this valuable information. I know I greatly appreciate it, and I know that all of the listeners do as well.
Thank you.